Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update extra video where I give you the extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war and what's going on around the edges and right in the centre. And we are going to start with tanks. Tanks has been a main sort of focus of attention over the last couple of weeks. Free the Leopards and all that. Abrams going, yada, yada, yada. It's exceptionally good news for Ukraine what has taken place. But originally there was this reluctance within the American Biden administration to send Abrams, and then Germany were sort of reluctant themselves to send Leopards, and then they very openly said, "Well, we'll send Leopards if you send Abrams." And so who was gonna budge? And it turns out the Americans are like, okay, let's send some Abrams type thing. And with this New York Times article, how Biden reluctantly agreed to send tanks to Ukraine, is an interesting insight into the process that took place and what happened that eventually ended up with loads of tanks being given, and today even Poland had said, oh, we're going to give out 60 other tanks, modernized tanks that aren't Leopards. So 14 Leopards that we'd already said we're going to give, and then 60 other Soviet era tanks that have been modernized. So I'll come on to that in a second. So I'm going to join the article halfway through. So Mr. Biden often says he has two goals: to liberate Ukraine and to avoid direct conflict between American and Russian forces. Increasingly, these two goals are in tension. On Wednesday, Mr. Biden insisted that the new firepower was intended to defend Ukrainian territory and nothing more. Quote, there is no offensive threat to Russia, he said. If Russian troops return to Russia, where they belong, this war would be over today. Both Mr. Biden and Mr. Schultz were worried about the proxy war imagery, though for different reasons. Mr. Biden worries about escalation in private conversations. Mr. Schultz made the case that even 8 decades after World War II, European nations would be uncomfortable seeing German tanks rumbling into battle, even in the cause of liberating Ukrainian territory. So on the one hand, America didn't want to escalate. On the other hand, you had Schultz worried about the optics of German tanks being in operation in a war in Europe, and other things will be at play as well, of course. So it continues after a call last week with Mr. Schultz, who is still finding his footing as the leader of Western Europe's biggest power. Mr. Biden began to relent. He told the Pentagon to set aside its many objections that the Abrams tank was ill-suited to Ukraine's needs and far too hard to operate and maintain for its stressed forces. It was a triumph of political calculation over logistical concerns. It made no sense to the Pentagon to go through the logistical headaches of sending the country's most advanced tanks to Ukraine when they were very capable German Leopard tanks nearby that could get to Ukraine faster and operate more efficiently. So at the time, there was you had Lloyd Austin and Milley saying, no, let's not send Abrams. Logistics are too difficult. They're fuel guzzlers, all this kind of stuff. Depends which level of and which upgrade of the tank you send, of course. And then the political calculation was, even though that is the case, we might as well just send them anyway because that will free up the Leopards. So what the Pentagon was not taking into account, one official said, was the intense fear among European governments of doing anything to provoke Russia without having the cover of the United States doing the same thing first. Quote, like it or not, that means the United States remains the glue that holds NATO and Europe together, said Peter Yule, a national security analyst in the newsletter The Liberal Patriot. Obviously, that's going to be kind of a pro-American stance there. However, there is a lot of truth in that, certainly with where NATO is concerned. After the meeting failed to produce, this is Ramstein, so sorry, there's a bit that talks about Ramstein. UK sent a bunch of Challenger 2 or promised Challenger 2 tanks. That didn't free the Leopards. And then Ramstein came about and Leopards weren't given the go-ahead, and everyone was expecting out Ramstein. So after the meeting, the article continues, failed to produce Germany's approval to deploy its tanks. The ensuing media reports pointed to the division as the biggest crack in NATO unity since the start of the Ukraine war. Some European officials argued that the split was overblown and that the tanks are less likely to provide a game-changing difference in the coming offensives. Missile defenses and precision-guided rockets like the HIMARS system in the United States are sent to Ukraine are more effective, they argue. I would say that's probably true. If you had to pick one or the other, HIMARS is an easier game changer, easier weapon to affect a change of the game, and I think longer range missiles would be preferable to tanks actually right now, personally. However, it's not either or. Why not both and? But as Often happens, the article continues, the tanks, a weapon easy for anyone to understand, resonant of wars past, became a litmus test. And after a year of using NATO unity as one of the Biden administration's key talking points about Russian failures in the war in Ukraine, senior administration officials realized that it was time for politics to trump the Pentagon's objections. Mr. Austin himself arrived at the conclusion after the meeting in Germany ended with a decision on the German tanks, according to aides telling associates that he did not see the sense of risking a fracture in NATO or a rift with Germany over the issue. By Monday, officials said both Mr. Austin and General Milley were on board with sending American tanks to Germany. To make the point, or to be seen making a point, Mr. Austin called Mr. Biden on Monday to recommend sending the Abrams tanks. While some lawmakers had suggested the United States needed to send as few as a single Abrams tank to unlock the German Leopards, the Pentagon leaders said that made no sense. If the United States was going to send its most important advanced tank system, it should send a battalion with combat power, one official said. The Ukrainian battalion has 31 tanks, so that was the amount the United States agreed to send. Absolutely, and that's how it happened, and that's really good news that it has happened, and now we're starting to see things sort of flow more freely. So this is what I was saying. In addition to its 14 Leopard tanks, Poland is ready to send 60 other of its modernized tanks to Ukraine, including the 30 of the PT-91, said the Polish Prime Minister. And Euromaidan News talks. Oh no, that's the wrong one. Actually, that's another. Um, Article I'm going to dip into. Here he said Poland sent 250 tanks as a first country half a year ago. So we forget that they've sent an absolute load of tanks, the T-72 um, era and other tanks already. Half a year ago, or even more than that, he said. Right now, we're ready to send 60 of our modernized tanks, 30 of them PT-91, and on top of those tanks, 14 tanks, Leopard 2 tanks from in our possession. And we have said to our partners in Western Europe how many tanks we've already delivered. And I've quoted President Zelensky to explain how important it is in this kind of war to have modern tanks. Russia has several thousands, or some say even more than 15,000 of the tanks in their stores. Was really big on trying to get as much stuff sent as possible. Meanwhile, we are seeing footage like this, which is a huge train in Poland bringing American equipment. Oh, goodness me, I do have the remarkable inability to press the right place on the computer screen. So just huge. I mean, look at that stretching all the way back. So, we are starting to see stuff arrive. And on top of this, Ukraine is organizing manufacturing of Indigenous 155mm self-propelled howitzer, the Bodana again. So this is a self-propelled howitzer, looks rather like that, reminiscent of sort of Caesar. Apparently, they are going to be building it again, according to Reznikov. That is well, um, now the Ukrainian armed forces are going to receive the artillery pieces in a few months. So obviously that would have been put in play earlier than now. It's not like they've just decided if they're going to get it in a couple of months. They will be being built at some point already. In June 2022, Ukrainian troops based in mainland Ukraine reportedly used a Bodana against Russian forces on Snake Island, which lies some 35 kilometers off the coast. There was talk about that being, was it Caesar's being put on barges and floated out and then shot at Snake Island. But it would be great for Ukraine to start getting their manufacturing their own indigenous stuff, including ordnance and including long range missiles. That is going to be more important, in my opinion, than these Bodanas. But yeah, we shall see how this all develops. So adding to this, other good news. First, Ukrainian soldiers are trained to use a Marder infantry fighting vehicle. That's a German one, according to the German Defense Minister Pistorius. The first Marders will be in Ukraine in about 8 weeks. So that's the end of March, which is when we hear that some of the tanks might hit their Challenger 2, I think, are being aimed for the end of March. Talking about British equipment, they've announced the transfer of more than 200 armoured vehicles of various types. So in the last tranche of military aid, we said a whole bunch of bulldogs, and that was the only thing that we were explicit on. It turns out that actually there's now going to be about 200 armored vehicles of various types, so Husky, Mastiff, Warhounds. We sent all of those out already. Spartan, they're a bit older, if I remember correctly, and Stormer. These are air defense vehicles, so they're useful. There are already some of those out there in Ukraine at the moment, but 200 of these is significant. Okay, so that is fantastic. Uh, the the build up for an offensive is looking good. With the amount of kit that's being promised to Ukraine, it's all about, as I keep saying, it's all about training. It's all about hitting the front lines broadly at the same time, not in dribs and drabs, is my opinion. Having those logistics sorted out and just being ready to go. Uh, yeah, fantastic. Norway will train junior officers of the armed forces of Ukraine and military doctors, and the exercises will be held in several stages throughout the year, and the beginning is scheduled for spring. Now, I think training is super important. If you listen to the Willie OEM uh, interview that I signposted this morning, I think that shows that there's a need to have training right throughout the ranks, actually, from top to bottom, in terms of Ukrainian forces, to get them thinking along the lines of NATO doctrine rather than the old Soviet doctrine, to get that kind of NCO core being enfranchised and able to make those reactive decisions, to just have quality training to be able to cope with the varied combined arms and the very decision making that needs to take place. Okay, talking about aircraft. So earlier on, I mentioned the French aircraft, and some people might have thought, in fact, someone did. I think it's Thierry said these aren't F-16, and I was like, yeah, I know that, but I wasn't clear on that. So French don't have F-16s or any of the F fighters. They have their own. They've got a long history of aircraft. So in fact, go look at the Falklands War, because the Argentinians, I think, they're using Mirages. Um, so this is a French person saying it's why do we learn from foreign press that some obscure deputy, I don't know what Macron now means, Thomas Gassiou, uh, president of the Parliamentary Commission for the National Defence, says that we're ready to deliver Rafale or Mirage 2000s to Ukraine, which is fantastic. The Telegraph has said this. French people are like, hey, why are we finding this out from the Telegraph? But that would be super cool. Obviously, well, not obviously. I presume that's not happened yet. Whereas I think the F-16s you've had Ukrainians been training on them for months. Secretary of the National Security Council Alexei Danilov has hinted that the supply of F-16 jets to Ukraine, quote, soon in the sky of Ukraine. He said to the Post, or in a post on his official Facebook account. He's clearly using momentum. There's a lot to be said about F-16. In fact, Lockheed Martin is ramping up productions of F-16, according to the Financial Times. American corporation Lockheed Martin has announced that it's ready to augment the production of F-16 fighter jets in order to meet Ukraine's demand for its combat aircraft. Wow. But actually, let's have a little. So this is something I recorded actually something like 3 days ago, 2 days ago. I'm going to slot it in now, and this is going to be about F-16 and uh, the logistics tail associated with that, and some of the needs of training for the F-16, which is hugely challenging. But bearing in mind, much of that will have already taken place, because actually, I think there has been training on the F-16, and we're probably coming towards the end of this. But nonetheless, I think this is a really useful thread to listen to. This thread is from July last year, right? So all the stuff he says is really interesting and important. So I'm going to read it out, but bear in mind that there's uh, every chance that all of this stuff has already been done, and it's been done for months. Okay, there has been apparent agreement over aircraft provision, as according to the head of Ukrainian Air Force. I read out something from him the other day, and I would bet my bottom dollar that Ukrainian pilots have been training there for months. It's a pretty long thread, this, so I won't read it all, and some of it's fairly technical. But when I was talking about Mark Hartling's thread from yesterday, talking about how difficult, or earlier today, can't remember, at some point, how difficult it is to get tanks ready on time. That's today, wasn't it? Uh, and it's not just a case of plonking tanks onto the battlefield and then filling them with people, and then there you go for it. It takes an awful lot of time to get them people trained for them, to get the maintenance people ready for them, to get the logistics sorted out, etc., etc. Well, when it comes to aircraft, it's even more challenging. So Thomas Tyner here says, let's talk complexity, a thread about F-16. So the F-16 is a capable fighter which is in service with 11 NATO air forces. Norway retired theirs this January. It's the fighter Ukraine will most likely receive from the US. So there's a lot of talk about them getting these aircraft. I explained why it will be the F-16 in the short April the 1st thread. I'm all for giving Ukraine 80 to 90 F-16, as it is a far better fighter than the junk Russia has. However, Ukrainian Su-27 or MiG-29 pilots cannot master an F-16 in a few weeks. First, let's talk air bases. The moment Ukraine lands F-16 at their air bases, Russia will hammer these bases with cruise and ballistic missiles. There's an interesting point here about whether that would definitely be the case, because surely you would expect Russia to be hammering those air bases already. They must be too far behind lines, or change position, protected by air defenses so much that Russia don't appear to be going for them. Or if they are, we are not hearing about them. So there's definitely a call as to whether Ukraine don't communicate whether bases are being attacked. We hear about infrastructure being attacked in these saturation bombing attacks, but never whether actual bases are really being hit. And but they're still flying their craft, so one assumes that the bases are still have runways that are operational. So, but I just wonder about that. Wonder whether there'll be a significant difference. Maybe if they're loading them with F-16s, then they will become more of a target for missile attacks. But yeah. So anyway, to continue, as he says, so before an F-16 can fly to Ukraine, each airbase needs a Patriot air defense battery to protect it from the Russian attacks. These batteries need to include the PAC-2 Gen Plus missiles against aerial threats, and PAC-3 and PAC-3 MSE missiles against missile threats. So these are the later variants of the Patriots that they're kind of will be thin on the ground for Ukraine. He's saying that obviously they need to put them around the bases rather than anywhere else, maybe near Kyiv or whatever. So before any F-16 can arrive, Ukrainian troops need to be trained to operate Patriot batteries, and that takes 30 weeks. As for F-16 training, the basic course is 9 months and includes 62 flights, and the basic course comes after 15 months of initial flight training with T6 and T-38. So training for planes. So those are the ones you can see in that photograph. That's one of the types. Ukrainian pilots can skip the initial training, but I doubt the intense basic course can be reduced. That's a lot of months. That's 9 months of flying. He's suggesting that can't be compromised after the basic course. But the question is, have they already been learning on these? There's been rumors that Ukrainian pilots have been training in the US for some time now, and I would bet my bottom dollar that that is true. After the basic course, the month-long suppression of enemy air defenses SEED course begins. So in the best case scenario, Ukrainian pilots can take to the skies after 10 months of training in the US, but also hundreds of maintainers and weapon technicians need to be trained. I don't know how long ground crew training is, but it will take many months, because you can't just mount missiles and bombs onto an F-16. First, you need to mount racks and rails. And he goes into a load of detail here about loading different racks and rails for different types of munition on F-16. I won't go into all the detail, and there's lots of like lots of model numbers and letters for different missiles, and then you see this infographic here that shows all the different things that you can load onto an F-16. My goodness. And each of those things will have a different strength, weakness, different target, different abilities, and with them you'd need different kind of mounting systems or components. So he goes on, let's look at SEED missions, so suppression of enemy air defense, so hitting missile installations, surface to air missile installations or radar sites. Missions to understand how complex the F-16 is and how many systems a pilot has to master before he can use it. For a SEED mission, 2 F-16s will be loaded out with 2 Sidewinders, 2 AMRAAM two Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, 2 AMRAAM air-to-air missiles, 2 AARGM air-to-surface anti-radiation missiles, so like HARM missiles, 1 sniper advanced targeting pod, 1 HTS to locate radar guided systems, one another serial number there or whatever, another code number, which combines an ECM electronic countermeasures pod with a AN ALE 50 towed decoy system, so on and so forth. The point is, as just to do seed missions, you need to load this plane up with an awful lot of stuff and tech and mountings for that stuff. This leads to free pylons, where either fuel tanks or additional missiles and bombs can be mounted. These two F-16 on a seed mission choose to mount two fuel tanks and use the ECM pod without the AN/ALE 50. These two pilots will fly along an enemy's air defense zone and try to incite enemy air defense sites to target them with their radars. So the idea is that they're baiting. This is how seed operations can work: is they bait the enemy air defense to lock in on them, and then once the AN/ASQ 213 detects an active enemy radar, the pilots will fire an AGM-88E missile, which will autonomously attack and destroy the enemy radar. The pilots will then use the AN/ALQ 184V9 to protect their planes from surface-to-air missiles the enemy air defense site might fire against them. If enemy fighters approach the F-16, they will use their AIM 120D to attack the enemy planes. With their sniper pods, they can fly over the enemy air defense site and check if the AGM strike was successful, maybe hit it again. If the F-16 carry GBU 39B or B bombs, they could use these in combination with the sniper's laser targeting to strike the remaining missile launchers and vehicles of the enemy air defense sites. So that's all fairly complicated. F-16 pilots need a month to master the basics of seed missions, and as Ukraine will have to fly seed missions before its F-16 can start bombing Russian positions, there is no way this training can be skipped. So the idea of Ukrainian pilots being able to fly F-16 after just a few weeks of training is absurd. If pilots would get just a few weeks of training, then they would be shot down by Russian air defense systems and fighters within days of arriving in Ukraine. If the fighters would even survive the first night on air bases without Patriot systems to protect them from missile strikes. Yes, Ukraine needs and deserves to receive F-16 as soon as possible, but it will take 8 to 10 months before F-16 fly in Ukrainian skies. That is why I tweeted on the 1st of April that the training of Ukrainian pilots needs to start ASAP. My comeback there would be, but we don't know they haven't. We don't know they haven't actually been doing that for 8 to 10 months. And if Ukraine wants to make the most out of its F-16, then KC-46 Pegasus aerial tankers and E-7A Wedgetail airborne early warning and control aircraft need to be delivered too. To interdict Russian aircraft, Ukraine needs radars peeking into Russia and Belarus. Ground-based radar is vulnerable to Russian cruise missile strikes, and the F-16 C or D, another bunch of letters and numbers. Radar has a range of 300 kilometers and an arc of 120 degrees, while the E-7A Wedgetail radar has a range of 600 kilometers and an arc of 360 degrees. So 4 E-7A Wedgetail will give Ukraine 24/7 airspace coverage. To interdict Russian fighters approaching Ukrainian positions, F-16 needs to be in the air 24/7, which means that they either need to mount fuel tanks, reducing speed and weapons loadout, or need to be refueled while on patrol. So Ukraine should get 4 KC-46 Pegasus tankers. But again, flying these and refueling F-16s takes time to master, and training for which has to begin now. Same as operating the Wedgetail. The US can provide Ukraine with everything needed to rebuild Ukraine's air force, but training needs to start now. I didn't serve in the Air Force, and Italy operated F-16 only for a short time, so my F-16 knowledge is limited, but I know 3 things. 1, Ukraine needs F-16. 2, it will take almost a year to get F-16 to Ukraine. And 3, DC's dithering is wasting time Ukraine doesn't have. My comeback again is we don't know that actually all those things aren't already in place. There's been talk already about Air Force stuff already being agreed. So the head of the Ukrainian Air Force admitted this recently. So that's all of this could be happening, and he need not worry. But if it's not happening, then this is all very pertinent, and this kind of complexity, needs time to train on and to be integrated into the Ukrainian system. So this complexity, he continues to applies to everything. Send Ukraine M1A2 SEP V3 Abrams tanks. Then you also have to send the M2A4 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles to protect the Abrams from Russian infantry and anti-tank guided missiles. And to make the most of the Abrams, Ukraine needs M88A2 Hercules armored recovery vehicles, so on and so on and so on and so forth. So there you go. That is just an insight into the complexity involved in giving kit to Ukraine. But hopefully that has already been overcome or is being overcome as we speak. But there will need to be, or there almost certainly is, just an awful lot of thought and an awful lot of training going into any new equipment sent to Ukraine that they are not used to using. Goodness me, you must be getting used to this by now. Having added that F-16 section in, this video is just massively long again, so I'm having to split it into two so I can edit one bit whilst the other is live and whatnot. So apologies, but you get two for the price of one. You can complain if you like down below in the threads. But in the meantime, thank you for your support. Really appreciate that. And look out for the second Ukraine War Update extra video that'll be coming out shortly.